I am a linguist by training, and that means I teach courses and I do research about language. It's not on, sorry. Okay. And whenever you ask someone what linguistics is about, 90% of the time they would tell you that, oh, it's about grammar, or it's about teaching people how to speak a language. In fact, one of the questions that I get asked over and over again is, how many languages do you speak? That's the question I just got asked at least twice since I came into this room. In fact, that's not what I do. Linguistics is also about us. It is about people. It is about how people act, how people do things, how people communicate in our society. And that's what I'm generally interested in. I'm interested in sociolinguistics. That's about how people use language in our society, the many possible ways in which people use language. And more specifically, my area of interest is called internet linguistics, which basically is about the interrelation between the internet and how people use language in society. And again, whenever I tell a colleague or anyone what I do in my research, they would be interested and amazed and interested at first, and then later they would start complaining about how people, young people can't speak properly, how they can't use English properly anymore, how they can't spell anymore, just because they're spending too much time on Facebook or WhatsApp or whatever kind of internet chatting. And to these people, the internet is just full of abbreviations, incomprehensible codes, emoticons, and so on. And it's always about young people. Young people are always at the heart of such complaints and concerns. And this kind of reaction is not surprising because we have been told from time to time that this is how people behave when they're chatting on the internet. So back in 2010, the Washington Post actually published an obituary for the English language, saying that the language is dead. It used to be dying, it's dead now. In an era of unedited blogs and abbreviations and instant messages and so on. And as a linguist, I'm always fascinated when the subject of language is covered in mass media reports. A classic case in point is this one, okay? Now, I'm not going to ask you to decode or translate this whole piece, as it's going to take another 18 minutes. But you may want to have a go with the first line. Who wants to try to decode the first line? Anyone? Or you can just shout from your seat. Okay, time's up. And here's the translation of it. So it reads, my summer holiday was a complete waste of time. Before, we used to go to New York to see my brother, his girlfriend, and their 3 screaming kids, face to face. I love New York, it's a great place. And it goes on and on, okay? But guess what? This is not a text message. This actually comes from an English essay written by a 13-year-old schoolgirl in Scotland back in 2003. And yeah, this is exactly the reaction that we got as this came out. So the teacher herself said, I could not believe what I was seeing, okay? I couldn't simply translate such codes. And someone from the government said, oh, there's no place for slang in exam papers. There wasn't actually any slang in that piece, if you look at it. Okay, slang is very different from text message. And then someone from the Teacher-Parent Association said there's a decline in standards of grammar just because of this craze for text messages, okay? But when interviewed, interestingly, the students said, well, I wrote like that because it's easier than standard English. Now, do you think that the student actually didn't know how to spell? Or do you think that she didn't know that she was not allowed to use text message in her exam paper? Okay? What's interesting in this case is the girl's resistance to the so-called standards language or proper English. So the questions that I'm going to explore with you today are these. So what is standards when we're talking about standards? Whose standards is it? Who imposes these standards? Are standards of English really falling? And if so, does the internet have anything to do with it? So first of all, whose standards are we talking about? Who imposes these standards? Is it the government, teachers, parents, or what? Now, the truth is, most of the time when we're talking about standards, it's easy to say standards of English, right? But when we're talking about standards, we don't really know what we're talking about, okay? Yes, there are grammar books, and yes, there are English dictionaries, but these books only offer a very limited view of language. That's what linguists call a prescriptive view of language, which is based on the assumption that there's only one best way of using language, okay? But in reality, as we know, there are many different ways in which we can use English. There are many Englishes, whether geographically or socially. Think about it, when you are writing a business report, the English you use there would be very different from the English you use, say, in a casual conversation with friends, okay? Speaking of standards, just last year, this is something that some of you may have seen already. Just last year, the education company, EF, published its annual English Proficiency Index for different countries, okay? In which countries were ranked according to the results of the tests produced by this company. And Hong Kong was rated moderate in English language skills, which is fine. But what really concerns people most when the report came out last year was that Hong Kong was ranked even lower than those cities and countries where English is not used as a second or official language. For example, Japan, South Korea, and Shanghai, okay? Of course, this immediately caught a lot of mass media attention, as you can see in these news headlines. But what I'd like you to think about is, while these results, these surveys may seem worrying, we must learn to question the methods behind these surveys. Do we really know who are being tested? Okay? Could it be people who were already quite educated in English already? Okay? Or could it be people who have never studied English before? Or how was the test administered? Okay? Was it administered online, which means that anyone could take the test? And what aspects of English was tested? So I'm inviting you to be more critical about such reports whenever you come across something like this in the future. And such worries and concerns about standard language or proficiency or falling standards of language often reflect what linguists refer to as standard language ideologies, which Lippert-Green defines as a bias towards an abstract, idealized, homogeneous spoken language, which is imposed and maintained by dominant bloc institutions and which names as its model the written language, but which is drawn primarily from the spoken language of the upper middle class. Incomprehensible, right? So basically just two things. First of all, when we're talking about standard language, we're really talking about an ideal construct only, okay? Something that we can't really grasp. It's very abstract, okay? We can't pin it down. And second, standard language is often the variety spoken by a small group of people in our society, say the upper middle class or those who are educated and so on. So we don't really know what exactly standard is. And coming back to the question, are standards of English really falling? I'm afraid I can't quite answer this question until we've come to a consensus as to what exactly standard is about. The question itself is very, very problematic and controversial as well. And the same idea can be applied to how the public are worried about the possible impacts of the internet on our language. Now have a look at this, okay? So what comes to mind immediately is, well, first of all, there's a missing punctuation between O and clock. There's a misspelling here in weather. And the structure of the sentence seems weird too, right? There should be at least some punctuation marks separating the sentences, right? Typical features of what seemed to be a lazy text message, right? But guess what? This actually comes from a postcard message written in 1907, okay, in England, addressed to someone called Miss Alice Ward. So my point is, historically, the invention of technologies has always had some impact on our language. Think about the invention of the printing press, the telephone, the radio, and even the television. Okay, all these have marked very significant phases in the history of writing and speaking. For example, the telephone has introduced a whole new way of spoken, one-to-one spoken conversations. So the issue that we're dealing with here is definitely not a new one. And in terms of the form of language, abbreviations and other unconventional forms of spelling have existed for a long time, even way before the age of the internet. For example, the abbreviation OMG for oh my God actually first appeared in 1917 in a personal letter to Winston Churchill. And think about other text types that we often come across in our society. Many of these types of text are indeed characterized by unconventional spelling and writing. Think about advertising, where you may see some unconventional spelling or deliberate misspelling. And think about Post-it notes. We never, or we seldom write in full sentences, right? Or even poetry, okay? So in this poem, Essay to Miss Catherine J., written by Charles Carabombo in 1890, some of the lines look strangely familiar to anyone with a mobile phone in this room. So for example, line 6, you have, I wrote to you before, which could appear in any of our text message, right? But it was written actually almost 130 years before the invention of texting. So in general, as language gets used by people, it inevitably changes. We can't really stop it from changing. But to tell you the truth, there has been indeed very, very little change to our language just because of the use of the internet, okay? If you think about the Scottish schoolgirl's essay, there was actually no new words at all, okay? So the girl didn't invent any new words or new grammar. So we're not trying to use a new language when we are online. And in my own research on how Hong Kong students use language on the internet, the proportion of abbreviations and unconventional spelling is actually very low too. But I'm not suggesting that texting can improve your English. I'm not trying to say that, okay? But there has been no empirical evidence proving the negative correlation between our language standards or our proficiency in English and how we use language on the internet. And by contrast, there has been studies trying to show the positive correlation between the two. So for example, in 2009 in England, students were tested about their language use on mobile phone. So one of the tasks was to ask them to translate between the so-called standard English spelling and the texting spelling. It's just like these words here. And the results actually showed that those who were better at spelling were actually the more frequent texters. We do have an explanation for that because whenever we are texting, whenever we're doing some kind of chatting online, we're not trying to invent a new language, okay? What we're doing is to play with our language. We're playing with our existing language resources. So to be able to play with language, we're actually operating within two systems. One is the so-called normal spelling or grammar system. The other is the so-called abnormal system. So that's exactly what David Crystal is trying to say here. So my point is, context does matter, okay? You don't expect everyone in this room to be speaking like a dictionary or a grammar book, okay? We don't want everyone to be talking in the same way. What is important is to know when to write in what ways, so context is important. Other factors may also shape how we use language in different situations. For example, on the internet, speed is always an issue. We want it to be fast. Let's say on WhatsApp, you don't expect to wait for 30 minutes, okay, before your next message arrives, especially when you see that your friend is online. There's also the issue of audience, who you're talking to. It's also about the content of the message, what you're writing about, and how you're using the medium is important too, okay? Are you doing it for social purpose? Is it for work purpose? Or are you simply doing it to draw attention or to get more likes on Facebook? Just like many of you here, I do a lot of WhatsApp messaging and texting, okay? And I would mix Cantonese with English, I would abbreviate, I would use emojis and emoticons like this. This is actually my own WhatsApp exchange. But I can also write formal emails like this one. And when I'm writing academic articles, I know that I can't write like WhatsApp messages. So this is exactly what writing is about, what use of language is about. It is about writing our identities too. So language use is always situated. It is always situated in its context of use, in our own everyday lives, and in our own ecology of language. 2 years ago, the linguist John McWhorter gave a TED Talk on a related topic with the title, Texting is Killing Language, JK, just kidding, okay? In which he made a similar point to David Crystal's. He said, what we're seeing is a whole new way of writing that young people are developing, which they're using alongside their ordinary writing skills. And that means that they're able to do two things. Now, what I'd like to add to that is texting is not just about young people. It's no longer about young people. We are all part of it. I'm part of it, you're part of it, your parents or even your grandparents. We are always writing something on the internet, right? That means we are always contributing our language to our own world. So my final message is keep texting, but always know the context, okay, and be appropriate. Now, I know this talk is being filmed at this moment, and I can see the cameras, and it will be uploaded onto YouTube. And perhaps I'll get comments like these. But it doesn't matter, right? This is exactly what the internet is about, okay? So social media like YouTube, like Facebook, have provided an unprecedented space for people to engage in different kinds of conversations about any topic, anytime, anywhere. So I look forward to engaging in further conversations with you about my topic here. Thank you very much.